US, but there is a forensics lab run by the state of Mumbai, India, where suspects who are potential suspects for crimes are brought into the forensics labs, have scalp EEG, electrodes placed on their scalp, and they have auditorily presented memory probes registered. Here, DP Sharma was a suspect in a murder case. They thought she might actually have murdered a romantic partner via arsenic. They brought her in, collected EEG brain data, looking for neural responses to the sentences about that contain crime relative facts. And based on the neural responses, the state-run forensic scientist brought the data forward, along with other circumstantial data, to trial. To say she has her brain, as we sort of are detecting from the outside, her brain carries evidence of crime-relevant knowledge. And not only does she have that neural marker of memory, but they went further and they made it through the conclusion that, in fact, the neural records, the neural traces, the neural signals indicated that she had these memories and she could only have acquired these memories from actually having participated in the crime. In this case, it was trial by magistrate. The judge ultimately convicted her of murder, and this came to the international community's attention. And if you read the judge's ruling, it's clear that the brain data were remarkably persuasive in leading to a guilty verdict. Think about a different application. So here we've got brain-based, arguably brain-based efforts to try to detect a particular mental state of an individual. Do they have memories for certain things that we care about in society? What about lie detection? There's been a number of cases in the US now where individuals who want to advocate for their position in court have gone to what was one or two commercial companies that were offering fMRI-based lie detection. There's now one, CPOS is no longer offering this service. Here's a case, this is the highest profile case, a US Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, where there was a scientific hearing held to determine and to assess whether or not fMRI-based lie detection data that was being offered by the defendant, who was accused of defrauding the government over $3 million in unjustified Medicare billings. The defendant wanted to enter fMRI-based lie detection evidence to support his claim that he was telling the truth when he states in court that 7 years earlier, while he billed the government for these charges, his intent was not to defraud the government. Is fMRI, here's another application of brain-based methods, trying to read out a different mental state, whether or not somebody is being deceptive or telling the truth. These collisions are just beginning. As mentioned, there's been a number of cases, at least in the States, there's been no cases as far as I am aware of efforts to try to enter fMRI-based evidence regarding the memory state of an individual, but there's been at least 5 cases of efforts to try to enter fMRI-based lie detection evidence. These collisions, whether it's about memory, whether it's about the mental state of deception versus truth-telling, whether it's about whether somebody is really experiencing pain versus not experiencing pain, and they're sort of lying about it. There's a desire, a hunger on the part of the courts, the legal system, for psychological science and neuroscience, if we can, to be able to bring evidence into these cases that are often difficult to resolve. Should this be happening? We're going to get to that on the back end, the second half of the talk. Well, there's been remarkable advances, and we'll talk a little bit about it with respect to memory, remarkable advances in terms of our understanding of the psychology and the neuroscience of many aspects of human mental states, including memory. There's this perception or this question or this concern as to whether the advances that are happening in the lab are beginning to be translated and beginning to sort of be applied out in the real world prematurely before they're ready. And in fact, around the time that the Sharma case came to the international community's attention because of that case, and then these fMRI-based lie detection services being offered, the editors of Nature Neuroscience basically made a call to the psychological and the neuroscience community and basically said, you don't tend to wrestle with these applied problems often. You think about theory. It's time to do it. You need individuals to start to critically appraise what can psychological neuroscience do in these realms. Just around that time as well, the MacArthur, John D. Patrick C. MacArthur Foundation decided to establish a network that brought together legal scholars, psychologists, neuroscientists, philosophers, to begin to wrestle with the and this sort of expected increased collision between psychological science, neuroscience, and law. And the network there's been two instantiations been around now since 2007, trying to sort of weigh in on and trying to help the legal system avoid misuses, early inappropriate applications, and try to develop new sort of ways in which the science might actually help lead to a sort of fairer and more just world as MacArthur is All right, here's our roadmap. I'm going to cover just a little bit, first half of the talk or so, about some of the advances in our understanding of what it means to remember, what it means to sort of, in the near future, when you're back home and you're telling somebody about some experience here, how is that being accomplished? What does that mean for your mind and your brain? We're going to talk a little bit about this, advances here. Can't tell anywhere near the complete story, but at least give you a part of the story. And then we're going to sort of pivot from there and say, well, given these advances, can we begin to weigh in on these questions and bring in the kinds of detection methods? Okay. All right, so let's start here. Let's think about sort of what remembering means in terms of us as organisms, and in terms of our brains and the psychological sort of products of our brains. Here's my favorite quote about memory. And it's a quote about a particular form of memory, the kind of memory we're talking about, episodic memory, conscious knowledge of individual life events. And it's from Chuck Klosterman, who's writing about the movie Memento, which came out around this time, 2003, 2004. And Klosterman wrote, most people consider forgetting stuff to be a normal part of living, and that's absolutely true. And in fact, the normal operations of memory should give rise to forgetting under very sort of principles, following very specific principles. But he's not talking about that. He's talking about amnesia, which is the condition that the central character of the movie Memento suffers from, and is in fact the condition that many patients, most patients who suffer from Alzheimer's disease, the first presenting deficit is in fact a deficit in the ability to build new memories for life events. So he's talking about that, and that freaks him out. However, I see forgetting as a huge problem in a way there's nothing I fear more. And it's this last quote that I think is fundamental in terms of a statement about what memory does for us. The strength of your memory dictates the size of your reality. If any of you have loved ones who suffer from Alzheimer's disease, as the disease progresses, you're acutely aware that their conscious reality is temporally very bounded, very brief. It's restricted to this immediate moment in time. We draw on memory. We draw on memories for life events to bridge time, to extend well beyond this immediate moment in time and the things that we're perceiving out there in the world and thoughts that we have in mind. To use those cues, those sort of mental content, to bring back to mind other information that can help us understand how it is that we got here to be interacting with this individual, what we're talking about, why it's significant, how it relates to other things we might have recently discussed, etc. The great psychologist Engel Colvin describes this sort of attribute of episodic memory as mental time travel. At some point in the future, you encounter a set of cues that relate to some past experience, and those cues transform. They lead to this sort of mental time travel back to some prior moment in your history as an organism and bringing to mind the things that have co-occurred with those cues and during that past event. And you're bringing this information to mind because it's going to allow you to figure out how to continue to interact and successfully operate at that moment in time. So what are some of the neural mechanisms that kind of stretch the size of our reality? How is this accomplished? Here, we're going to just take a sort of a system level account of episodic memory. And we're going to sort of cartoon it to think about, but in this cartoon, we're going to try to highlight some of the big components of what it means to build and then reinstate a life event in the brain. So if you think about an event like this experience you're having at this moment in time, your brain is representing multiple features. You're in this room, you have visual cues being presented, you've got my voice, my face, the content, the meaning of the words I'm saying, etc. It's all co-occurring within this context. Different attributes of event are represented in different cortical and subcortical structures. And so for this moment in your brain's history, there are patterns of activation that represent different attributes of this particular experience in different parts of your brain. These patterns of activation that are coding for different features of the event ultimately propagate forward onto this structure that sits on the inner wall of the temporal lobe, the medial temporal lobe, a structure called the hippocampus, which in terms of the information flow hierarchy of the brain is kind of at the apex of the hierarchy. We've got all of this highly processed sort of outputs coming from these neocortical sites and subcortical sites projecting onto the hippocampus. And it's the hippocampus alone that is aware in a dumb sense, of the co-occurrence of all of this information at the cortex. The wiring in cortex and in subcortical structures is insufficient for there to be, off of one-shot learning, direct binding of this information with this information. This information must project into and converge on neurons in the hippocampus, which then form an association that then, at some point in the future, can be used to unlock that memory and to, in essence, transform the neural state of our brains at that moment in time in the future, we were remembering, back to where it was during the prior experience. So at some point, you might see my face walk across campus if you are local, and that might ultimately converge on a stored representation of the hippocampus, a subset of the neurons, the hippocampus can pattern complete out its full or complete pattern, and drive reinstatement of the things that had co-occurred with my face during that one experience in your past. This room, context of this conference, etc. What evidence is there for this particular model of memory, this particular model of remembering the past? Well, there are a couple of components to the model. One, that recollecting or remembering a past event entails this reinstatement of cortical patterns that were present during the prior event, during the original event, and that this reinstatement emerges from the sort of hippocampal mediated or dependent sort of pattern completion that's driving the activation of the cortex. And perhaps not surprisingly, the degree to which one can reinstate these patterns out of the cortex via the hippocampus partly depends upon having successfully established that information in mind during the original event itself. With advances in functional brain imaging, up until really when I was a graduate student, when I entered grad school, came out of UCLA, functional imaging didn't exist. I know it's kind of hard to believe, and probably everybody in the room sort of takes it for granted. It's hard to believe that the internet didn't exist previously, et cetera, right? Computer didn't exist, TV didn't exist. But, so, when I came to grad school, I largely thought I was going to be doing behavioral experiments looking at the workings of the memory. And I still do that, and that's a very powerful approach. The combination of behavior with now the advanced imaging tools that have emerged from really the early 90s, but really started to take off in the mid to late 90s, and with further advances into the statistical treatment of the data in the 2000s, we can now address questions that I never imagined we could address when I headed off to grad school. So, what can we do with imaging that bears on this problem? So here's some early data looking at this question of, well, what evidence is there that when we're remembering, we're reinstating patterns that were present during the original event? The early days were to look at the cortex, look at our brains, and sort of measure where there was signal during a set of events, and then ask the question, when individuals were remembering events of type 1 versus events of type 2, you see increases in activation in those same sort of brain structures. So here's an example. During the learning part of the task, subjects were presented individual visual words, and they were paired with either a picture. You might see the word dog, and an image of a dog, or the word dog, and the sound of a dog barking. And then retrieval and fMRI data, functional magnetic resonance imaging data. This is sort of an indirect measure of neural activity indexed by changes in blood oxygen levels that are correlated with changes in neural activity. The fMRI data were collected during learning of word picture pairs and word sound pairs, and then at retrieval, all the subjects saw were visually presented words. And they had to bring to mind, gee, did I study a picture with that word, or did I hear a sound with that word? And here are the data. Very simple analysis of data. The analysis consisted of asking for each point in the brain where I have this measure of neural activity, this fMRI measure of neural activity. Where was there more activity on the trials in which subjects saw pictures or heard sounds? And that's what you see here. These are areas where there was greater activity when you were seeing pictures, so both hearing sounds, and not surprisingly, activation is in early visual cortex up to sort of mid-visual cortex, area fusiform gyrus and lateral occipital complex that represents complex visual object form. And here, if you're hearing sound, your activation is more, there's greater activity in auditory cortex, primary, secondary, and association auditory cortex relative to seeing pictures. The advance in this study was, well, what happens when, in both cases, you're seeing a visually presented word? Where do you see activity when people are remembering that a picture had co-occurred with it, or a sound had co-occurred with it? You can see that, in fact, when you're remembering having seen a picture, there's greater activity in part of visual cortex relative to remembering having heard a sound, and vice versa here. So this begins to provide a hint that, in fact, at the time of remembering, we're reactivating parts of the brain that were present during those experiences. Let's move it from here. This is percept. What about thoughts? Here, in encoding, subjects are seeing individual words, and they're imagining. So they're not seeing a picture, they're imagining a face, or they're imagining a scene that might co-occur with that word, or be fit by that word. And then at retrieval, they're trying to remember what their thought was previously. And what you see is, in fact, when people are imagining scenes, you get activation in what's been dubbed the parahippocampal place area, amongst other parts of the brain. When you're imagining faces, you get activation elsewhere. And during remembering, you get what looks like increased activation in the same cortical structures. Remembering scenes versus remembering faces. This is hints of evidence, right? That, in fact, during remembering, we're reinstating patterns of activation during the experience. These were kind of the early days. I know it's hard to believe that this could be the early days about a decade ago, but the advances in machine learning techniques that were not developed for neuroscience, but are being leveraged by Google, Facebook, many of the large tech companies, amongst many others. Advances in machine learning techniques allow us now, have allowed the field to move beyond asking this question on average, which points in the brain show greater activation when somebody's remembering a face or somebody's remembering a scene. Can we actually quantify on a trial-by-trial basis rather than averaging across a whole host of them, the distributed pattern of activation across multiple parts of our brain, multiple points in our brain? Can we quantify that activation pattern and its similarity to the pattern that was established during learning? And these machine learning tools now allow us to do that. So what you would do in such a study, and I'll describe some data to this effect, you might imagine during learning, you're having two different kinds of events. Events in words, say, co-occurring with pictures of people, words co-occurring with pictures of, say, famous landmarks. And what you do is you take the data across visual cortex, occipital and temporal cortex. You take this pattern of data across the thousands of voxels you have, thousands of points in those parts of our brain, on each of the experiences, each of the learning styles. You feed those patterns into a classifier, and you try to determine whether the classifier can find a boundary that maximally discriminates the pattern of activation in this individual's brain when they're when they're viewing faces versus when they're viewing scenes. And then you can take some left out data just to make certain that the classifier has actually learned something. You can take some left out data. All you have now is you're taking this on a single trial, this pattern of activation across visual cortex. You're feeding it into the classifier and you can ask, can I, by looking at this pattern of activation on this one learning trial for this individual, can I read out what the person was looking at? And the classifier will give you some probabilistic sort of assessment as to whether that pattern maps onto category A or category B. So this is kind of decoding, trying to sort of read out what the person is currently experiencing. But you can do the same thing. You can take a retrieval pattern at some point in the future and ask the question, can I, by looking at this pattern of activation, in this one moment in this one individual's brain, can I figure out what they experienced previously, what they're remembering, what they're bringing to mind? So here is our roadmap for this part of the talk in terms of trying to see how the field is using these sort of multivariate machine learning tools to decode information out in our cortex, both during experience and then as a function of remembering. We want to try to quantify the strength of cortical reinstatement and see if it relates to human memory behavior. We want to ask the cortical reinstatement covariate with hippocampal signal at retrieval. With it, to test the model, it's the hippocampus that's driving the cortical reinstatement. We want to ask what's the relationship between the evidence at retrieval and the strength of the information out in our brain as actually encountering the event. Okay. So let's first, just a couple of examples, brain-based mind perception and memory. Here, we're in the learning, the perception part, and the uncoding part of the experiment. Subjects are seeing individual words and they're paired with faces of famous people or images of famous landmarks. The journal forced us to mask out Steve Martin and all of our other famous actors and actresses' eyes because we didn't have their permission to use their faces. So you'll forgive the Tron-like or Robocop-like nature of Steve Martin there. But anyway, so the first thing we might ask is, can I look at an individual's brain and decode whether they're seeing a word and seeing a face or seeing a word and seeing a landmark? Just by looking at the individual's brain patterns, we're near perfect. You know what information they're actually represented in mind during the actual experience, the learning episode. What happens now when we strip away these sort of the visual information? We make a memory test. They're encountering the individually presented words, and they're cued to try to bring back to mind what had co-occurred with that stimulus at that one moment in their brain history, at one moment in their past. And they could say, I don't know. They could say, well, I remember it was a face, or I remember it was a building, but I don't remember who, and I don't remember any of the details. Or they could say, yeah, I remember it was Steve Martin. I remember specific details about that past event. Well, if you take now the brain data as people are retrieving these memories, and when they say they don't know, or they say I can remember the category, or they say I can remember the particular instance of a face or the scene, how similar does the cortical pattern look at retrieval to the pattern that was established during decoding? When subjects say they don't know, here chance is 50%, here's the x-axis kind of a measure of evidence with 0.5 basically being no evidence. And you see we've got a normal distribution centered on 0. When a person says they don't know, when they're seeing a retrieval cue, what they previously encountered, there's no evidence out in their cortex of replay of any of the patterns that were present during the experience. When a person says, I can remember the category, I know it was a face or I know it was a landmark, the distribution of cortical evidence is shifted to the right. The cortex looks more like the pattern of category A if the item that they're remembering is in category A. Right? This is sort of accurate recall. When the person says, not only can I remember the category, I can remember the details, the evidence is even stronger. The similarity of the pattern during remembering to the pattern that was present during learning is even stronger. So here we've got this systematic relationship between the strength of cortical reinstatement That is the similarity during retrieval to the pattern that was present during learning. And these sort of memory states. I don't know. I can remember vaguely what I encountered. Oh, I can remember the details. And when we're wrong, when the subjects are wrong, and they're claiming to remember having seen a face when they've actually seen a landmark, in fact, the cortical pattern looks shifted a little bit to the left. It's a little bit like they're reinstating landmark evidence, even though they've seen a face. It's kind of false. This is cortical evidence associated with false memory that might, in fact, be driving their memory mistakes. So these data is just one demonstration that, in fact, we can quantify the similarity between a cortical pattern when we're remembering to the pattern that was present during learning, and it seems to relate to memory behavior. Here's a second and final study along these points, just to sort of highlight the potential power of it. So here during learning, subjects encounter a task telling them they should either perform a person imagery or scene imagery task on the following word. And they're doing this during learning, and we're taking brain images of the patterns elicited during person and scene imagery as it's occurring. And then at retrieval, they get old words, and they have to try to bring back to mind whether or not they imagined a person or a scene. And training the classifier now not on perception but on imagery, we can differentiate by looking at patterns of activation when people are engaged in imagery of faces or imagery of scenes. We can kind of read out with 80% accuracy what they're thinking about, what they're imagining. Taking the classifier training on the brain data at learning and asking, well, feed in the retrieval data, what is the classifier, how does it do it? Here's what we observed. The classifier can, in fact, decode whether or not the person at retrieval is remembering having imagined a person or a scene. These are correct files. And in fact, we have this hint of cortical evidence looking like the wrong kind of content being brought to mind when people have a false memory. But more importantly, we can treat the cortical pattern in a continuous manner. The similarity between the cortical pattern and retrieval to the pattern and coding. We can treat it in a continuous manner. And we can ask, well, how accurate is the subject's behavior on this retrieval task? What's the relationship between the subject's behavior on the retrieval task and this strength of cortical reinstatement? And what you can see is, in fact, there's a clear relationship. You can look at the similarity, again, between these two states, and you can kind of know, is the person more likely or less likely to be right in terms of what they remember? Turns out, if you now look at hippocampal activation during moments of retrieval, the magnitude of hippocampal activation at the moment of retrieval, here on the x-axis, is correlated with the subject's memory accuracy. It's also correlated with, in a negative way, with how quickly the person can make the memory mistake. That is, hippocampal activity at retrieval seems to be co-varying with the strength of memory, which allows people to be more accurate and to retrieve the information more quickly. And it's correlated with the strength of cortical reinstatement. That is, the greater the hippocampal signal at retrieval, the greater the similarity with the brain's pattern is at that moment in time to the pattern that was present during the original event. Okay? The last point, which we'll do very quickly, is, in fact, not surprisingly, I'm sure, the ability to reinstate a cortical pattern at some point in the future critically depends upon having effectively established that pattern in the first place. And that's just sort of the last observation, which is we can quantify the strength of evidence during learning, during the actual experience here on the x-axis, and predict whether or not the person's going to remember or fail to remember the event, whether they're going to make the memory decision quickly or more slowly, and the strength of the cortical pattern at retrieval to be predicted by having established that pattern in the first place. Okay? Skip over this last bit. Just want to sort of make this point that hopefully it sort of dives in and sort of hammering on it. It's just one set of observations illustrating how the combination of psychological science and neuroscience are beginning to allow us to get quantitative measures and leverage on the mechanisms that build forget memories and then reinstate those memories. And that allows us to sort of now travel back in time, but the field has also come to appreciate that memory has utility not because it allows, solely because it allows us to think back in time and to bring details about the past forward to inform our current thinking, decisions, actions, but also because we can draw on memories and the same neural system, hippocampal cortical interactions, to simulate possible futures, to transport ourselves forward in time, to plan for what we're going to be doing when we get back from Stanford, from this conference, to think about what we'll be doing in a few months, et cetera, and to build memories of these sort of prospective sort of goals, and use then those prospectively sort of generated memories to shape our behavior going forward. Okay, and I'm not going to comment on that, but I just want to make this point that these same systems not only allow us to sort of mention time travel back, but also travel forward. All right. I could wax on, probably already getting a clue. I can babble on about memory for weeks. I kind of love this. I fell in love with sort of the power and the frailty of our memory systems when I was about to learn state training. So let me transition for the remaining 15 minutes. Remaining 15 minutes to sort of tell you a story that I've been on where we've been trying to take now our basic science of surrounding memory and start to sort of just ask this question, well, what can brain imaging do in terms of this potentially applied question, can we detect memories or not? The data that I presented might suggest, in fact, that one can. I'm going to highlight very briefly a few experiments that suggest the promise of this approach, but then I'm also going to highlight some points that suggest that there's potentially real peril as well. I want to make the point I'm not advocating for the use of these tools out in the real world, in the wild today. It's more trying to take an agnostic or unbiased consideration of the science and just kind of ask what are we capable of now, and where does it work, where does it break? All right, so here are a couple of questions that might have some legal relevance, at least the judges I may have will tell you is important. Is it possible to detect whether a person recognizes the stimulus previously encountered or perceives it as novel? That is, if you suspect that somebody had a particular experience, they might have seen somebody, can I read out by looking at their brain pattern whether they have any evidence that they've seen this particular face or not? Separate from their memory state, whether or not they're remembering or they're failing to remember, they have no memory. You might also ask, is it possible to detect whether a person encountered a stimulus regardless of whether or not they remember it? That is, can I read out implicit memory? Can I read out the true history of an organism, a person, with some past stimuli? Can I decode that from their brain, whether or not the person's remembering or failing to remember? All right, here's experiment one. Very simple experiment. Stripped down, non-real world. We're talking about individual faces presented in the lab, in a full lighting on a computer screen. The faces presented for a brief period of time. They're resemble nothing like the complex real-world experiences that would be probed in a true legal setting. Okay, so this is sort of just a getting going first study to see what one can do. Individual faces presented one at a time during learning. There are a total of 200 faces. Then the subjects come into the MR scanner. We're collecting brain measures as they encounter old faces, 200 old faces, and 200 new faces. These are foils. For every face, the subject makes a memory decision. I recognize having seen that face before. I don't recognize it. The memory evidence I have is below my decision bound to call old from an color. Okay? So for old faces, you might recognize, the subject might recognize the face, so we call this a hit. Or they might forget the face, we call this a miss. For new faces, they might correctly say, oh yeah, that's a novel item, correct rejection, or they might have a false memory for the face, so a false alarm. Okay. Taking the brain data after retrieval, and we're asking, can I, from brain patterns, know whether or not the person has encountered the face before or not, or whether they recognize the face or not. Okay? We're going to get into this very same analysis approach. We're going to use multivariate machine learning pattern analyses because they allow us to make an assessment at the individual subject level, which is what the law cares about, what the real world cares about, and at the individual test type level. For any real world application, what the courts are going to want to know is this individual, this face, does the person have memory or not? Yes or no? Okay? So we're going to take these test patterns, we're going to take a subset of them, these brain patterns at retrieval. And so for this classification, we might take the hits and we might take the correct rejections, train a classifier, and then feed in some held out brain data on a particular trial and ask, what does that pattern look like? Does it look like category A or category B? Okay. The first classification we're going to do is, do they recognize old items as old? Is there evidence in their brain that for this recognition of old items as old versus perception of new items? Across the subjects in this study, our classification accuracy across all their trials was well above 10. Much higher, further above 10 than I actually initially predicted. Though in hindsight, I should have probably predicted this level of performance because we know that in fact, remembering is, and I kind of hinted at it in the first part of the talk, is a multi-process, multi-component cognitive and neurobiological act. There are many things that are occurring in our minds that differ when we're remembering something that's old versus perceived. Individual parts and points of the brain, and if you try to do memory decoding from just a small here, 123 voxels, say here, you can be well above chance. You can find that you can be above chance from using signals from many parts of the brain. Okay? This is one of